Somewhere around 45, a lot of women get quietly told, without anyone actually saying it out loud, that their story is basically finished, that whatever life they haven't built by now probably isn't coming. Today's story is about a woman who was handed that exact message twice in one single week, and who decided, against every voice telling her it was too late, to build an entirely new life anyway. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. On this channel, we tell honest stories about resilience, reinvention, and the quiet courage it takes to start again when everyone assumes your best chapters are already behind you. This particular story may change the way you think about what's still possible for you. Her name was Diane Foster. She was 45 years old, and for the previous 19 years, her entire adult identity had been built around two roles: wife to a man named Gary, and marketing coordinator at a regional furniture company. Then, within the span of 11 days, both of those identities disappeared completely. It started with Gary. He came home on a Sunday evening, sat her down at the kitchen table, and told her, calmly and almost clinically, that he'd been unhappy for years and had decided to move out. There was no affair, no dramatic betrayal she could point to and blame entirely on him. Just a slow, quiet drifting apart that neither of them had bothered addressing until he'd apparently already made peace with leaving. "I still care about you," he said. "I just don't think I love you the way I used to." Diane sat frozen at that table for nearly an hour after he finished packing his first bag, unable to fully process that 19 years of marriage had ended, with a sentence that sounded more like a performance review than a heartbreak. 11 days later, before she'd even finished sorting through the emotional wreckage of her marriage, her manager called her into his office and informed her that her position was being eliminated as part of a company-wide restructuring. "It's nothing personal," he assured her, "just business." Diane nodded politely, collected a small severance package, and walked out of a building she'd worked in for 12 years, carrying a cardboard box that somehow felt heavier than it should have. Here's the part worth sitting with honestly. It wasn't just the divorce, and it wasn't just the job loss. It was the timing of both landing in the same 11 days that made Diane feel, for the first time in her adult life, like the entire foundation beneath her had simply vanished overnight, leaving nothing solid left to stand on. That first month was, by Diane's own later admission, the darkest stretch of her entire life. She moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town, furnished mostly with items Gary hadn't wanted from their old house. She spent evenings scrolling through job listings, most requiring skills she hadn't actively practiced in over a decade, feeling increasingly invisible in an industry that seemed to favor candidates half her age. She stopped answering calls from old coworkers who wanted to check in, unable to explain her situation without her voice breaking halfway through. Her daughter, Kelly, 22, and finishing college 2 states away, called every few days, worried but unsure how to help from such a distance. "I keep telling my friends my mom's going through a rough patch," Kelly admitted during one call. "But I don't actually know how to explain what's happening, Mom. Are you okay?" Diane didn't have an honest answer for her that week, so she simply said she was managing, the same vague reassurance she'd give anyone who asked. One particularly difficult night, sorting through old photographs while packing up the last of her things from the house she'd shared with Gary, Diane found herself sitting on the floor of an empty closet, crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry since her father's funeral years earlier. She remembers thinking, with a clarity that frightened her, "I'm 45 years old, and I have absolutely no idea who I am without a husband and a job title." If you're still watching this story, don't just feel sorry for Diane. Ask yourself something honest. How much of your own identity is quietly built around roles that could disappear tomorrow? roles you've never actually questioned, because you never had to. For the first 2 months, Diane applied to nearly 60 different marketing positions, receiving only a handful of responses, most polite rejections, citing candidates whose experience was a closer fit. One recruiter, during a rare phone screening, actually asked her directly whether she felt comfortable keeping pace with a younger, more digitally native team, a question that stayed lodged in her chest for days afterward. Diane's sister, Carol, urged her to consider something completely different. "You've always talked about wanting to do something with your hands," Carol reminded her one evening over coffee. "What happened to that idea you had years ago about furniture restoration?" Diane laughed it off initially. "I'm 45, Carol. People don't start new careers at 45. They just try to hold on to whatever they've already built." But the idea refused to fully leave her alone. Years earlier, long before marriage and mortgage payments had filled every available hour, Diane had genuinely loved refinishing old furniture, a hobby she'd abandoned somewhere around her 30th birthday, when life simply got busier than the time it required. She still remembered the specific satisfaction of stripping away old, damaged varnish and revealing something worth saving underneath. Here's the sentence worth pausing on, the one Diane later said changed everything for her. "A small severance check is not your biggest problem. Believing you're too old to start something new is." She wrote that sentence on a sticky note and pressed it to her bathroom mirror, where it stayed for nearly 2 years, faded and curling at the edges, until she finally didn't need to read it every morning to believe it anymore. She began small, almost embarrassed by how small it was. She bought a broken side table from a thrift store for $8, spent an entire weekend sanding and refinishing it in her apartment's tiny balcony, and posted photos of the finished piece in a local buy and sell group, mostly out of curiosity, rather than actual ambition. It sold within 6 hours for $65. It wasn't much, but something about that first small success cracked open a door Diane hadn't realized was still available to her. Over the following months, Diane developed a modest but steady rhythm. She scoured estate sales and thrift stores on weekends, hunting for damaged pieces with good bones underneath years of neglect. She taught herself new techniques from free online videos late into the night, ruining several pieces badly enough to laugh about it later, slowly improving with every attempt. She converted her apartment's small storage unit into a makeshift workshop, the smell of varnish and sawdust becoming as familiar to her as her old office's carpet and fluorescent lighting once had been. Her severance money didn't last forever, and there were terrifying weeks where Diane genuinely wondered if she'd made an enormous mistake. She picked up part-time hostess shifts at a local restaurant to cover the gap, standing on aching feet after full days of sanding furniture, exhausted in a way that felt entirely different from the exhaustion of her old office job. Harder physically, but somehow lighter emotionally, because for the first time in years, every hour she spent building something felt entirely, undeniably her own. There was a particular Tuesday, roughly 8 months in, when Diane ruined an entire commissioned piece by using the wrong stain, watching weeks of saved-up material costs disappear in a single afternoon of frustration. She sat in her tiny workshop that evening, covered in sawdust, seriously questioning whether Carol's suggestion had been a mistake after all. She called her sister that night, half expecting sympathy, and instead heard something closer to tough love. "You spent 19 years getting good at a job you didn't even love," Carol reminded her. "Give yourself more than 8 months to get good at something you actually do." Gary, meanwhile, had settled into a new relationship within several months, something Diane learned secondhand through a mutual friend, rather than from him directly. There was a period where this news reopened old wounds badly, sending her into a weekend she barely remembers clearly, curled up on her small couch, surrounded by half-finished furniture projects, questioning every decision that had led her to this exact moment. But she kept returning to her workshop anyway, sometimes purely out of stubbornness rather than passion, refinishing pieces even on days when she didn't particularly feel like it, trusting a version of discipline she'd learned from years of showing up to a marketing job she hadn't even particularly loved. Discipline, she was slowly discovering, didn't require passion to function. It simply required showing up, especially on the days passion felt entirely absent. By the 1-year mark, Diane had built a small but genuine following on social media, documenting her restoration process in short videos that strangers seemed to find oddly soothing. A local interior designer discovered her page and reached out, requesting 3 custom-restored pieces for a client's home renovation. That single commission paid more than an entire month of her old marketing salary. Word spread slowly through word-of-mouth referrals. By her 2nd year, Diane had quit hostessing entirely, renting a small standalone workshop space behind a hardware store on the edge of town. She hired a part-time assistant, a college student named Priya, studying interior design, who reminded Diane occasionally of herself at 20, minus the fear of starting too late that had nearly stopped Diane before she'd even begun. Kelly visited the workshop for the first time that same year, during a school break, and stood quietly in the doorway for a long moment before saying anything. "This is really yours?" she finally asked, running her hand along a half-finished dresser. Diane nodded, watching her daughter take in the sawdust, the half-finished pieces, the small handwritten price tags on the finished ones, lined against the far wall. "I used to worry about you," Kelly admitted quietly. "After the divorce, after you lost your job, I didn't know if you'd be okay. I don't worry about that anymore." It was, Diane later said, one of the proudest moments of her entire life. Prouder, somehow, than any promotion she'd ever received in her old career. Here's the part that still surprises Diane herself when she tells this story now. The marketing skills she'd assumed were entirely wasted after her layoff turned out to be exactly what her new business needed most. She understood branding instinctively. She knew how to tell a story around a product, how to photograph a piece so its transformation felt genuinely emotional rather than merely decorative. 19 years of irrelevant corporate experience had actually been quietly preparing her for a business she hadn't even known she'd eventually build. On the 3rd anniversary of the week that had once seemed to end her entire life, Diane hosted a small open house at her workshop, inviting clients, neighbors, and her sister Carol, who cried openly at the sight of what her sister had built from an $8 side table and a broken marriage. Priya organized the whole event without being asked, insisting Diane's story deserved to be told properly, not brushed off the way Diane usually brushed off compliments about her own work. Gary, coincidentally, drove past the workshop that same week, curious after hearing about it from a mutual acquaintance. He didn't stop in. Diane heard about the drive-by secondhand and simply shrugged when she found out, feeling, for the first time in years, genuinely indifferent to what he thought of any of it. "I used to think starting over at 45 meant I'd failed at something," Diane said, reflecting on those early terrifying months. "Now I think 45 was exactly when I finally started paying attention to what I actually wanted, instead of what I assumed I was supposed to want." So here's something worth sitting with tonight. Is there a version of your own life you quietly abandoned years ago, convinced that timing, or age, or circumstance had already closed that particular door permanently? Diane didn't have any guarantee that an $8 thrift store table would eventually become a thriving business. She simply refused to accept that 45 automatically meant the interesting chapters of her life were already finished. Diane still keeps that very first side table in her workshop, unsold. A permanent reminder, positioned near the entrance, where every new client sees it first. When people ask about it, she tells them the truth. That's not my best work. It's just the piece that proved to me it wasn't too late to try. She's since taught a handful of free weekend workshops for other women, going through their own difficult transitions: divorce, layoffs, empty nests, the specific kind of quiet grief that comes from realizing an old identity no longer fits. She doesn't pretend to have a formula for other people's lives. She simply tells them what she wishes someone had told her during that month she spent crying on an empty closet floor. That the timeline you assumed your life was supposed to follow was never actually a rule. It was just a guess, made by a younger version of you who didn't yet know everything you know now. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's quietly convinced themselves it's too late to start something new. Sometimes the only thing standing between where you are and where you actually want to be is a single small decision to simply begin, regardless of your age. Tell us in the comments, is there something you've always wanted to try, but talked yourself out of because you thought the timing had already passed you by? Diane would probably tell you the same thing she tells every woman who walks into her workshop, looking exactly as lost as she once did. The timing was never actually the problem. It was just the easiest excuse to believe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.